The golden child crashed the family business. Now they're blaming the black sheep. Some families carve legacies with blood and grit. Mine etched theirs in favoritism and denial. I don't remember the exact day I became the outsider. It was never a singular event, more like a slow bleed. 1,000 little cuts disguised as well-meaning comments, careful omissions, glances that darted over me like I was furniture in a room they didn't want to redecorate. I was the wrong mold, the undesirable equation, the one who colored outside the lines while they handed my brother a golden pen and told him to sign the family name in cursive glory. My parents owned Van Holt & Company, a modest manufacturing company that began with textile roots and bloomed into something more, thanks in part to a few smart expansions and the gentrification of our hometown. To them, the business was bloodline and backbone. It was more than livelihood. It was identity. They wore it like a badge, the name engraved on jackets, embossed on coffee mugs, stamped onto their very sense of worth. And to them, my brother Garrett was the future, the heir, the chosen continuation. They gave him the company when he was 26, fresh off a padded business degree, full of jargon and charm, still wet with the sheen of parental adoration. I remember the party. Polished oak floors, champagne flutes sweating against linen napkins, handshakes passed like currency. I had been invited as an afterthought, tucked in the corner with relatives who asked me what I was doing these days, with the kind of forced interest that doesn't wait for answers. When the announcement was made, Garrett stepping up, my father's hand on his shoulder like he was knighting him into destiny, no one looked at me. No one thought to. I was a different story, a B-plot in a family saga that didn't bother with depth. I'd left town for art school, pursued design, freelanced, traveled, started my own projects. None of it made sense to them. To them, creativity was ornamental. Nice if it could be monetized. Nuisance if it couldn't. Garrett was a businessman. I was, well, something else. Something they didn't have the language to celebrate. Still, I tried. In those early years I showed up, brought ideas. I even offered to help revamp the company's dated branding, streamline their digital footprint, overhaul the customer experience. Gifts, really. Hours of labor and creativity packaged with nothing expected in return. But Garrett smiled the way people do when they're being humored, and my father told me gently, "We don't want to get too experimental." That was their way of saying don't meddle in things you don't understand. And so, I stepped back. Not because I didn't care, but because I'd finally understood. There was no room for me at the table unless I came bearing apologies and admiration. They didn't want help. They wanted compliance. Years passed. I built my own work quietly, took on bigger contracts, built a reputation that outpaced even my most ambitious early dreams. But I never brought it home, never flaunted it, never tried again to make them see. I stayed the black sheep, unbothered, unread, uninvited. Until Garrett ruined everything. The downfall was slow at first. You had to know what to look for. A client contract lost here, a questionable hire there. Marketing dollars funneled into vanity projects that did little more than boost his ego. He started pushing into industries he didn't understand, over-leveraging the company's reputation on personal whims, partnered with developers who smiled too easily, shook hands too quickly, and disappeared before the ink dried. But my parents didn't see it, or didn't want to. They praised his ambition, defended his missteps, covered for him publicly, while quietly cutting corners to balance the losses. I heard murmurs through the grapevine. Ex-employees whispering about layoffs, delayed payments, shady accounting. I stayed quiet. It wasn't my place. It never had been. Until I got the call. It was a Tuesday. My mother's voice sounded like it had been scraped across gravel. Polite, brittle, unfamiliar. "Could you come to the house?" she asked. "Your father and we need to talk." I thought someone had died. When I arrived, the mood in the room was far colder than grief. Garrett was there, seated like a scolded schoolboy, his jaw tense, his hands trembling in a way that had nothing to do with remorse. My father paced. My mother wrung a cloth napkin in her lap as if trying to throttle an invisible adversary. No one offered me a drink. No one asked how I'd been. They didn't even say hello. "Van Holt & Co. is in trouble," my father said finally, the words landing with all the subtlety of a gavel. "Severe trouble." I stayed still. Garrett looked at me in years. He looked scared, but also, somehow, defiant. We need to talk about responsibility, he said. And just like that, I knew. They were going to blame me for not helping, for not stepping in, for not sacrificing my life for a legacy I was never allowed to touch. They spun the narrative like master illusionists, that I'd abandoned the family when they needed fresh ideas, that I'd taken my skills and used them for strangers, that if I'd cared about the company, I would have made the effort, that the market had shifted, that younger demographics didn't connect with the brand, that someone like me could have prevented the decline. Not Garrett, who had signed off on a failed product line. Not Garrett, who had spent hundreds of thousands on a digital campaign that didn't launch. Not Garrett, who had written checks to cover trips in cars and cocktail parties meant to impress investors that never materialized. No, me, the ghost sibling, the absentee creative, the one who had turned their back on the family. I needed your help, Garrett said, voice thin, eyes wet. You knew things I didn't. You could have stepped in. And when, exactly, I asked slowly, was I supposed to do that? Silence. When you ignored every offer I made, I continued. When you told me to stay in my lane? When you told people I was too weird to understand business? We were just trying to protect the company, my mother murmured. You always seemed distracted. No, I said, my voice steady. You just didn't like that I didn't need you. That landed like a slap. My father looked at me like I'd spoken in tongues. You think we wanted this? He growled. To have to ask you. To sit here and admit. No, I interrupted. I don't think you wanted to ask. I think you wanted to blame me before you had to admit that Garrett failed. Garrett flinched. You think this was easy for me? I leaned forward, quiet fury tightening each syllable. You ran a company into the ground while calling yourself a visionary. You ignored advice, burnt bridges, and hired friends over professionals. Then, when it caught fire, you screamed for the person you said didn't matter. He stood. Don't pretend like you know everything. I don't. But I know enough. Enough to know that you were never going to let me help unless you could take credit for it. They didn't speak. They didn't apologize. They sat in the ruin of a dream built on favoritism and fantasy, and expected me to clean it. And I stood. I left, not out of rage, but clarity. Let them sit with the silence. Let them mourn the myth. Let them wonder what could have been. I wasn't the black sheep anymore. I was the only one who saw the storm before it hit. And now, I had a choice. Step in and take control of the wreckage, or walk away and watch them drown in it. But if I did return, if I picked up the pieces, it would be on my terms. No more shadows, no more silence, no more apologies for being the one they underestimated. The days after the confrontation unfolded like gauze, slow, heavy, and suffocating in their insistence. I didn't answer their follow-up calls, ignored the terse text messages that came not with apologies, but with veiled demands. My father's first message was 2 words. Call me. My mother's came hours later. We're trying to make this right. But nowhere in those messages was there a confession of fault, only the implication that now, after everything, I was supposed to come back and fix the mess they had made in my absence. I sat in my apartment surrounded by blueprints of projects that had nothing to do with them, windows to a world I'd built with my own hands, and tried to untangle the knot that had settled at the base of my spine. This wasn't just about the business. It was about being scapegoated for decades. It was about being erased, discounted, labeled too much or not enough in the same breath. And now, when the golden child's halo had rusted and cracked, they had come looking for a replacement light source, expecting me to shine without being asked how I'd survived in the dark for so long. I didn't go to the office right away, but I drove past it, twice. Once in the early morning when the parking lot was mostly empty, the lights inside blinking like a machine still struggling to run despite missing parts. Once again in the evening, when a group of mid-level managers smoked near the back alley, their laughter brittle and cynical. The logo out front was faded now, the once burnished metal oxidized by years of neglect. The windows hadn't been cleaned in months. The front desk light was off. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was decay, and everyone saw it. It was an old friend who finally broke the wall of silence I'd built around myself. Theo, from college, now running a boutique consulting firm downtown. We'd stayed in touch through social media, drifted in and out of each other's lives like moons orbiting separate planets. He'd always been sharp, not just book smart, but intuitive. The kind of person who noticed what others didn't say. He called me out of nowhere. "I heard through a client that Van Holt's going under," he said, voice careful but unflinching. "I wasn't going to bring it up, but then I heard your name." My stomach twisted. "What about it?" "There's talk," he said. "Not good talk. Rumors that you were the one behind some of the recent contract losses, that you tanked a proposal, that you badmouthed the company to investors. I haven't been within 10 feet of that building in years." "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm calling." The rage came not in an explosion, but as a slow burn fire across my skin. They weren't just blaming me internally. They were poisoning the outside air now, spinning narratives like spiders, desperate to cocoon themselves in excuses. "They're trying to rewrite history," I said quietly. Theo exhaled. "They're trying to salvage what's left. You're convenient. You always were." That cut deeper than I expected, because he was right. They had spent years positioning me as the weak link, the unpredictable one, the artistic eccentric who didn't understand real responsibility. And even now, when the truth was carved into financial statements and staff resignations and ruined vendor relationships, they still refused to hold the golden boy accountable. "They want me to come back," I said after a pause. "Fix it. Would you?" I didn't answer. Instead, I asked him to meet me. We sat at a corner table in a cafe I used to visit when I first moved back to the city, before I gave up trying to make my family proud. Theo brought printouts. I brought silence. The documents were worse than I imagined. Revenue loss in the millions, unpaid debts, a pending lawsuit from a distributor who claimed breach of contract. The marketing budget had been blown on influencers who didn't deliver. The digital platform they'd launched had gone live for only 6 weeks before being taken down due to back-end errors caused by a freelance developer Garrett had hired because they were friends from undergrad. "I shouldn't care," I admitted, fingers drumming against my mug. "I should walk away and let it burn." Theo looked at me for a long time. "But you do care." "I care that they're going to rewrite the ending, that they'll tell the story like I stood by while everything fell apart, that I let it happen." He nodded. "Then don't let them." Returning to the company felt like entering a building mid-collapse. Not physically, but spiritually. You could feel it in the way people looked at you, furtive, cautious, like they weren't sure whether to greet you as a savior or a saboteur. The receptionist, who used to smile at Garrett like he walked on water, barely made eye contact. In the elevator, I heard a junior analyst mutter, "That's the sister," as if I were a cautionary tale come to life. Garrett wasn't in. Neither were our parents. I walked through the corridors like a ghost with a heartbeat, memories crashing into me at every turn. The meeting room where I'd once pitched a full rebrand, only to be met with polite dismissal. The corner office where Garrett had insisted on frosted glass and imported furniture. The tiny break room where an intern had once pulled me aside to say, "I really liked your design suggestions. They just didn't have the guts to listen." I found her still working there. Her name was Rosa. She looked up from her computer, startled, then smiled, soft and tired. "I wondered when you'd come back," she said. "I didn't think I would." "Garrett's not taking meetings," she offered, as if protecting me from disappointment. "I'm not here for a meeting," I said. "I'm here for the truth." She blinked, then leaned in. "They've been scapegoating you," she whispered. "Even internally. Told the board you turned down a consulting contract, that you ghosted them, that you undermined their pitch deck with an investor you used to work with." "I never even saw a pitch deck," I said. "I know, a few of us know, but no one wants to speak up. Not yet." Something settled in my chest. Not anger, not relief, permission, to stop apologizing, to start reclaiming. That night, I stood in my apartment, surrounded by silence, and opened the box I'd kept sealed for years. Inside were sketches, concepts, proposals, notes I'd made when I still believed there was a place for me in Van Holt, ideas I'd buried because no one ever asked, a full redesign of their product packaging, a multi-phase expansion into sustainable materials, a new outreach initiative targeting local talent. I ran my hands over the old pages. Then I began to build a new one. Not for them, but for me, because I had a vision. And this time, they weren't going to stop me. Not by blaming me. Not by rewriting me. not by pretending I hadn't always seen what they refused to admit. The golden child had burned the house down, and now I would raise something better from the ashes, on my own terms. It was never just about the company. That realization struck me sometime around 3 a.m., when I found myself sitting on the hardwood floor of my apartment, surrounded by a sea of design mock-ups, dusty notebooks, and long-abandoned proposals that still bore the scent of hope. For years, I'd locked away every impulse to dream for them. Every time I'd started to sketch out a better brand story, a sleeker product line, a campaign that spoke to the customers they refused to understand, I'd stopped myself before the ink dried. Why give blueprints to a builder who doesn't want your hands on the project? But something had shifted since my unannounced return to Van Holt's crumbling offices. The place was worse than I'd expected. And not just financially. It felt stripped of its soul, if it ever had one. I walked through each hallway with the sensation of stepping into someone else's memory, distorted and hollow. The whispers were everywhere now. I was no longer a ghost, more like a rumor that refused to fade. They said I was back to gloat, that I was here to pick the carcass clean, that I had returned not to salvage, but to conquer. They weren't entirely wrong. Still, before I could act, before I could lay a single brick for the future I was starting to shape, I needed to understand just how deep the rot ran. I needed to see the numbers, the contracts, the lies dressed in business casual. And to do that, I needed access. The kind only Garrett could give, or in this case the kind he had likely left unguarded because he believed himself untouchable for so long. He never imagined anyone would dare challenge him, especially me. That Thursday morning, I went back, not as a visitor, not as the black sheep on a mercy errand, but as someone ready to peel back the walls of a legacy built on exclusion and ego. Rosa met me at the door, her hair pulled back, her jaw tighter than before. "He knows you're coming," she said, without needing to ask if I was ready for the fallout. "I'm not here for permission," I replied. She hesitated, then nodded toward the elevator. "He's in the executive conference room, with your parents." Of course he was. It felt too symbolic not to be scripted. The golden child flanked by the architects of his pedestal, hiding behind oak doors like they could will the narrative back into shape. When I stepped inside, they fell quiet. My father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. My mother wore that familiar expression she always reserved for moments she couldn't control, a soft blank look painted over worry lines. Garrett, in contrast, looked oddly composed, but there was a tick in his jaw I recognized. He was waiting for a fight, bracing for a script he could control. "What are you doing here?" he asked, more weary than furious. "I'm here to see the books." A pause. He blinked, once, then twice. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. I want full access to the company's financials, internal communications, client histories. All of it." My father laughed, a dry, joyless sound that curled at the edges. "You have no stake here." I tilted my head. "You made me a scapegoat. That gives me a bigger stake than any of you realize." My mother shifted. "We know things got complicated." "Complicated?" I echoed. "You mean when you started telling people I torpedoed your contracts?" Garrett stood, palms flat against the table. "Look, we were under pressure. People wanted answers. It was a way to explain your failure?" I cut in. "Or protect your image?" His eyes flared. "Don't talk to me like you've been here. You haven't had to make real decisions. You've been out there freelancing, designing logos, writing tweets?" I walked forward, every step deliberate, letting the weight of his words bounce harmlessly off my chest. "I built a brand from nothing. I turned clients into communities. I took every lesson you dismissed and created something sustainable. Meanwhile, you were throwing money at illusion. You were gambling with loyalty. You were painting gold over cracks until the whole thing caved in." Garrett looked away. "I want to help," I said, "but not as your Band-Aid. I want transparency, full access, and I want decision-making power. Otherwise, I walk." My father stood slowly. "We gave Garrett this company, and he ran it into the ground." Silence. My mother looked at me, and for a second her face betrayed her, the tiniest flicker of fear, the realization that maybe, just maybe, they'd miscalculated the durability of their perfect son. "You want to take over," she said flatly. "No," I said. "I want to rebuild it, not for you, not for him, For the people you'll hurt when this place collapses if someone doesn't." They didn't answer, but they didn't stop me either. Rosa handed me a thumb drive later that day. It contained more than numbers. It held the entire unraveling of Garrett's curated empire. I pored over late-night transactions labeled client engagement that were clearly personal trips, expense reports padded with ghost vendors, marketing spend that couldn't be accounted for beyond vague notes like strategic visibility. But what broke me wasn't the financial hemorrhage. It was the resignation letters. Dozens. Some polite, others gutted with frustration. Designers who left after being ignored. Salespeople cut off from decisions that affected their territories. Developers forced to launch broken code because deadlines were tied to ego, not readiness. And one from a woman named Kayla, a junior coordinator who I vaguely remembered from her intern days. Her letter was short, brutal in its clarity. "This company rewards arrogance and punishes honesty. I loved this job, but I cannot work under a culture that confuses legacy with leadership." I read it 3 times. Then I called Rosa. "Who still believes in this place?" I asked her. There was a pause. Then she replied, "Less than half. But they're good. The ones who stayed, they're just waiting for someone to give them permission to care again." It wasn't a takeover. Not yet. It was a presentation. 1 week later, I stood in the same boardroom that once echoed with my brother's plans and laid out mine. Clean, focused, ruthless in its honesty. I didn't promise miracles. I didn't speak in platitudes. I spoke in truths, metrics, timelines, failures. I didn't hide what Garrett had broken. I didn't embellish what I could fix. I just showed them what they hadn't seen in years: accountability and vision. When I finished, no one clapped. They just nodded. And since I was a teenager standing in the background of my brother's coronation, someone actually said, "We should have listened to you sooner." I didn't smile, but I let it land. Garrett didn't attend. My father sent an email the next day, short, formal, detached. "We recognize your insight. Please proceed. Your mother and I will be stepping back for the time being." I didn't reply. Not yet. There would be time for that later. Or not. Some apologies are better written in absence. And me? I wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The black sheep wasn't coming to the table. I was building a new one. And I was inviting the people who were always meant to sit there. Not because of blood, but because they believed before the house caught fire and stayed after the flames. I didn't think taking over would feel like this. I'd imagined anger, some vindication maybe. Flashes of satisfaction as the empire that once cast me out was quietly surrendered into my hands. But what I felt instead was exhaustion. Not the kind that settles in your muscles after too little sleep, but the bone-deep kind. The kind that comes from carrying weight no one else sees. Every step forward through the doors of Van Holt & Company came with a memory tethered to the heel. I had to drag years behind me just to make it to the threshold. Every insult unspoken, every time I was told my ideas were a little too much, every time they asked me to just be supportive, while they handed my brother the whole kingdom for nothing more than being predictable. What they hadn't realized, what they still didn't understand, was that I had never wanted their scraps. I didn't come back to patch holes in Garrett's sinking ship. I didn't do this to inherit ruins or salvage nostalgia. I came back because I knew what this place could have been, what it still might become. I came back because I couldn't watch them pretend the fire started itself while they stood there holding the matches. The first few days weren't dramatic. They were quiet. The kind of quiet that sets in after a storm when the air still smells like lightning. Employees watched me with that side-eyed glance people give when they're waiting to see if you're a real leader or just another act in the family circus. Rosa walked beside me through every meeting. She didn't speak unless necessary, but her presence alone did more than 1,000 memos could. People trusted her. And if she stood beside me, they were willing, at least tentatively, to listen. I started small, one room at a time. The design department, once vibrant and alive, had been gutted, physically and emotionally. The walls were bare, the whiteboards blank. The only sound was the hum of tired machines and the quiet rustle of people trying not to be noticed. I asked to see the mock-ups that never got used. At first, no one moved. Then a junior designer, Malik, early 20s, eyes wary, slid a folder across the table. Inside were 10 branding concepts that were better than anything the company had released in years. Bold, clean, human. They weren't just good, they were powerful. They told stories. They felt like Van Holt could have had a heartbeat again. Why were these shelved? I asked. He hesitated. Garrett didn't want anything that looked too modern. Too modern? I echoed. He said we had to protect the brand legacy, keep it classic. I nearly laughed, but I didn't. Instead, I stood up, walked over to the wall, and pinned all 10 to the board. We're not protecting a legacy anymore, I said. We're rewriting one. Something shifted then. Not a thunderclap, not applause, but posture. Eyes met mine, shoulders loosened. Ideas started to breathe again. It would take time, but they were with me now. And more importantly, I was with myself. Garrett showed up 3 days later, unannounced, wearing sunglasses indoors like he was protecting his ego from natural light. I found him waiting outside the glass conference room, leaning against the frame like it might break under the weight of what he still believed was his presence. "You don't return my texts," he said, voice tight. "I don't owe you that anymore." Still dramatic, I see. And you're still pretending this wasn't your fault. He stepped into the room uninvited. His cologne hit me before his words did. I remembered being 8 years old and watching him practice handshakes with our father. They'd say things like, "Command the room" and "take space with confidence." They didn't teach listening or consequences. You think this place is going to love you just because you showed up when things got bad? No, I said evenly, but they'll trust me because I'm not lying to them about how bad it is. Garrett paced. You don't understand what it takes to hold this place together. You don't understand what it means to earn it. He laughed, but it cracked at the edges. You think you're some kind of hero? No, I said. I think I'm just not afraid to be honest. That alone makes me better than the version of you they had to follow. You came back because you wanted this all along, he snapped. I didn't flinch. I came back because you made sure there was nothing left to come back to. He stopped. I looked him in the eye. I gave you years. Patience, ideas, silence. You called it betrayal every time I didn't fall in line. Now the only reason I'm standing here is because people still want this company to survive and they're too tired of watching you sink it. Garrett didn't respond. He didn't storm out either. He just left. Shoulders tighter than before. Like a man realizing too late that the applause was never meant for him, only the spotlight. The board wasn't easy. The senior partners had been carefully cultivated by my father and Garrett over years of loyalty testing and shared favors. Most of them were business lifers, people who believed leadership looked like suits and sternness, who had only ever dealt with men at the top. I didn't fit their mold, and I didn't try to. I didn't speak in buzzwords. I didn't promise profit in 90 days. I walked in with data, vision, and the confidence of someone who had failed alone and learned to rebuild without a safety net. I told them the truth, that we were sinking, that covering Garrett's missteps had burned bridges with suppliers, partners, and clients, that we'd lost credibility, but also that the bones of the company were still good. The heart was still there, buried under the rubble. The people still believed. They just needed someone to finally believe in them back. I proposed restructuring, tighter budgetary control, reviving the core product line, outreach initiatives, collaborative marketing driven by story, not sales. Some stared, others scribbled notes. When I finished, no one asked questions. They just stared like they were seeing a ghost in a familiar house. Then, one voice, an older man, Brent, I think. Been there since before I was born. He nodded slowly. It's been a long time since anyone in this room said something worth listening to, he said. And that was it. The shift. Not seismic, but real. Later that week, I hosted an all-staff meeting, in person. No Zoom, no emails. I stood in the old warehouse, what used to be the shipping floor before they outsourced that. Before they stripped the building for parts. It was dusty, ugly, real. Most of you know who I am, I began, and most of you probably have your opinions about why I'm here. I let that sit. I'm not going to ask you to trust me, not yet. I wouldn't if I were you. A few quiet chuckles. But I am going to tell you what's going to happen. We are going to stop pretending. We are going to start building again, and if you stay, if you want to be part of that, then I promise in a long time, you'll be heard. I didn't need applause, but the silence that followed felt different. not skeptical, hopeful. That was enough. The next few weeks were a blur. Meetings, strategy sessions, rehires. I brought back 3 former staffers who'd left under Garrett. They didn't come easily, but they came. One by one, the tide shifted. Departments started to talk to each other again. People stayed late, not from obligation, but from excitement. I slept 4 hours a night. 8 when I remembered. Watched a company rise from its own ashes, not as a monument to the family that failed it, but as proof that black sheep can lead the herd when the wolves finally fall asleep. And I didn't feel like an outsider. I felt like a builder, not of what they gave me, but of what I chose to take. And there was still more to build. There's a strange quiet that comes after momentum. Not a stillness of defeat, but something subtler. A hush that falls over your shoulders the moment you realize the scaffolding is finally up. And now you have to decide what kind of structure you're going to build inside it. For weeks, I had moved through the ruins of Garrett's legacy like someone gutting a home with their own hands, ripping out the rot, clearing the mold, naming the damage for what it was without ceremony or sentiment. But now that the space was clear, the silence stretched long and wide, and it demanded a deeper kind of courage, not to survive, but to create. The company had stabilized, on paper anyway. With new contracts inked and old ones mended, the bleeding had slowed. My team, once scattered and scared to speak, now stood shoulder to shoulder with sharpened focus, quietly reclaiming the pride they'd been taught to suppress. I saw it in their eyes, the way they lingered longer in meetings, stayed past office hours without being asked, smiled at each other in the hallways. It was a fragile thing, still, this trust, but it was real. Not built on guilt, but belief. Not demanded, but earned. What I hadn't expected, as the days stretched into a rhythm I hadn't known I needed, was how difficult it would be to confront the wreckage that lived outside the office walls, the damage that had nothing to do with spreadsheets or quarterly projections, the kind that lives in old conversations, bitter birthdays, and the rooms we still enter quietly, hoping not to stir the ghosts. I hadn't spoken to my parents since the last board meeting. They hadn't reached out, and I hadn't extended the olive branch they likely thought was owed to them. There was nothing left for them to explain. They'd made their choices, built their mythology, pushed me out and pinned their hopes on a son who smiled when cameras were pointed and shut doors behind him when they weren't. What more was there to say? But family, especially family that sees itself as an institution, has a way of showing up at the most inopportune moments. I should have expected it when I saw my mother's name appear on my phone that Friday afternoon. I was in the middle of reviewing a second phase launch for our updated branding campaign, seated beside Malik and 2 new hires who were barely out of college but spoke like they'd already lived 3 lives. I let the call go to voicemail. Then a text came through. Please, just dinner. No apologies, no pretense, just the plea. That night I sat in my car outside the restaurant for 10 full minutes before going in. Not because I was afraid of them, but because I wasn't sure who I would become once I walked through the door. There are roles we wear around family like armor: the disappointment, the failure, the strange one, the child who didn't behave. I had shed all of those in the fire, but I knew they would try to pull them back over me like a familiar coat, whether they still fit or not. They were already seated when I walked in. My mother, dressed in neutrals, face carefully made up like the past few months hadn't happened. My father, still wearing the same watch he'd received when the company hit its first $1 million in sales. The same watch he'd once said Garrett would inherit. And Garrett, hair disheveled, posture uneven. He didn't look defeated, not quite. But the shine was gone, the armor cracked. In my memory, he looked like someone who'd finally been forced to look at his own reflection too long. We exchanged pleasantries. Drinks were ordered, menus barely touched. Then silence. Thick and unwelcome. It was my mother who broke it. "We've been watching the news," she said, as if that were a gesture of affection. "I'm sure it's a nice change to see your daughter's name mentioned without scandal." She didn't flinch, but she also didn't smile. "It looks like you've done a good job," my father said next, voice low. Grudging. I nodded. "I didn't come for approval." "Then, why did you come?" Garrett asked, leaning back like he already regretted asking. I stared at him for a moment. I came to see if any of you had anything real to say." They looked at each other, then back at me. "We're proud," my mother said eventually. "No, you're relieved," I corrected. "There's a difference." They didn't deny it. Garrett finally spoke, and his words surprised me. "I thought I could handle it," he said. "I really did. I thought being the one everyone trusted meant I'd figure it out when it got hard. But I didn't, and when it started falling apart, blaming you was easier than admitting I wasn't built for it. I didn't look away. You weren't just bad at it, Garrett. You were reckless. People lost jobs, their trust, years. I'm not angry that you failed. I'm angry that you tried to take me down with you." He looked down. "I know," he said quietly. And I believed he did. I didn't forgive him, but I believed him. My mother's voice came next, brittle but steady. "We didn't see you," she said. "Not really. We were so focused on building something that looked like legacy that we didn't stop to ask what kind of legacy it was." "And now?" I asked. "Now we're watching you build something better." It wasn't an apology, but it was a beginning. Not a clean one, not a cure, but a crack in the wall. I left them there, still sipping coffee, still trying to shape the silence into something graceful. I didn't owe them the blueprint. They would have to build their own. Weeks passed, then months. The new Van Holt wasn't perfect, but it was honest. We launched our new campaign with a short film instead of a banner ad. The voiceover wasn't a slogan. It was Malik, reading a quote he'd written during a brainstorm session that stayed with me. "Sometimes you don't build a brand, you build a mirror, and then you make it strong enough that people can stand in front of it and see themselves without flinching." It went viral, not in numbers, but in meaning. Clients returned, new ones followed, investors called, not because of me, but because of what we made. Garrett never came back. He moved cities, took a job in someone else's company. For once, he wasn't the headline. My parents sent flowers on the 1-year anniversary of the relaunch. No note, just lilies and a card that said, "Thank you." I placed them in the lobby beside a plaque that read, "Built not from inheritance, but intention." Because that was the truth of it. Not all inheritances come in paper and property. Some come in silence, some come in fire, and some come in the voice you finally reclaim after being told for too long that it was too loud, too soft, too strange, too wrong. I didn't rebuild their house. I built mine, and I filled it with people who didn't need to be told who I was to believe in what we were building. And this time, the foundation wasn't made of legacy. It was made of me. The company turned its first quarterly profit under my leadership exactly 13 months after the fire began. Not a literal one, though in many ways it had felt just as hot. The building had stayed intact, the walls hadn't crumbled, and yet everything inside those glass panes had been scorched beyond recognition. The only thing that had survived was the skeleton of what Van Holt & Company used to be, and I had been the one to rebuild it, bone by bone, dream by dream. Not out of revenge, not even for redemption. I did it because no one else could, because someone had to prove that a name didn't need to be golden to carry weight. That legacy wasn't something inherited, it was something earned. The office by then had changed, literally and metaphorically. The old family portraits that used to line the front hallway, photos of my parents at ribbon cuttings, Garrett shaking hands with partners he later abandoned, were gone, replaced by photographs of the staff, candid moments taken during our weekly brainstorms, our client meetings, our long nights that turned into early mornings. I'd hung one in the lobby myself, Rosa laughing in front of a whiteboard, coffee in one hand, dry erase marker in the other. Beneath it, I'd written a quote on a metal plate. "People before profit isn't a tagline, it's a promise." People noticed, not just inside the building, but beyond it. News outlets that once had only mentioned my family in dry financial reports began calling our news story a quiet revolution. Investors who had pulled out during Garrett's reign began asking for meetings again. But this time, we weren't desperate. We weren't selling the story of a savior or a dynasty. We were telling the truth, showing the work, inviting those who believed, not in names but in values. And they came. The last of the lawsuits were settled, contracts renegotiated, staff rehired. We weren't a giant yet, but we were alive, breathing on our own, without crutches, without shadows. One afternoon, Rosa stopped by my office with 2 mugs of tea. She placed one in front of me without a word, then leaned against the edge of my desk. You look like someone who just ran a marathon and forgot to collapse at the finish line." I smiled, the kind that still felt new on my face, because it doesn't feel like a finish line, just a different track. She sipped her tea, then fixed me with that steady gaze she'd always had, the one that saw past titles and noise. "You know, for what it's worth," she said quietly, "I don't think you were ever the black sheep." I raised an eyebrow. "I think you were just the first one who realized the fence was never real." That stayed with me for a long time. The final reckoning came not in fire, but in paper. A letter arrived from my father, a real one, handwritten in his exacting script, on cream-colored stationery with the faint watermark of the Van Holt crest at the top, the same crest he used to say was as good as a passport. "Eleanor, I won't pretend I understood what you were doing. Not at first, not even halfway through. I watched from the sidelines, afraid to say something that might be received as criticism, or worse, as weakness. But I see it now, the way people look at you, the company you've brought back from ruin, the way your name carries something I never managed to give it, meaning. I've spoken with your mother about this. She agrees. We've decided to formally step down from the board. Permanently. The shares are yours. All of them. We want no further involvement. Not out of punishment or shame, but because it's time to let go of the thing we tried too hard to control. Your brother. He sends his regards. He's working again. Quietly. I think for once he's found peace in not being watched. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope we haven't burned every bridge beyond repair. But even if we have, I want you to know. I see you now, and I'm proud of who you've become. Dad. I read it once, then again, and then I folded it and placed it in my desk drawer. Not to bury it, but to remind myself that some closures don't come from revenge or confrontation. Sometimes they come in the simple act of being seen after so long in the dark. A year passed. Then 2. By the time we opened our new headquarters, modern, solar-powered, collaborative, the company had more employees than it did at its peak under Garrett. Our client retention was the highest in the industry. We held quarterly team story sessions where people could share their personal growth, not just their metrics. And the new mentorship program, Rosa's idea, had tripled interest from emerging talent in our field. I no longer needed to prove myself. I no longer had anything to prove. What had once been a fire built from resentment had become a lighthouse, guiding, grounded, and always moving forward. I stood in the atrium of the new building the morning it opened, sunlight pouring in through the glass ceiling, and I realized something I hadn't been able to admit until now. I had become the very thing they told me I never could be, not despite them, but because I chose to stop waiting for their permission. And that, more than profit, more than praise, was what freedom really looked like. The door behind me, once closed with bitterness, no longer needed locking, because I had already walked through the last one I'd ever need, and I wasn't going back. Not ever.